Hi, welcome back to the channel. I just want to cover today a common question we get from students and expats that move to Romania for the first time and don't have necessarily a lot of experience with renting. What you should and what you should not find in a rental or lease agreement. So I just want to go through each of the elements of that and maybe tell you a few things to watch out for. In essence though, a rental agreement in its simplest form is simply a record of all the things you agree on between yourself and the owner of the property in terms of how you're going to use the property, how it should be maintained, how you should return it, and the cost involved. But let's go through each of those elements one by one. So the first element of a rental contract is the name and address and the contact details of each of the relevant parties. So the owner, contact details, also the tenant, and you may be, for example, if you're a young student, you may have a guarantor behind you, a parent or something, so you also have their contact details. That's not uncommon at all. The property details, the exact address of the property, the term of the agreement, it might be 12 months, might be 18 months, may even be a shorter lease. It's worth mentioning at this point, there is actually a distinction between a lease agreement and a rental agreement, although most people don't make that distinction and maybe not even aware of it. And typically in Romania, people refer to a typical lease contract as a rental contract or a lease contract. But there is a difference, and the difference is that a lease agreement typically is for a fixed period of time, such as 1 year, 18 months, 2 years, and a rental agreement tends to be for a shorter period, such as 1 month at a time. And at the end of that 1 month time, you can in fact renegotiate the terms and conditions, maybe the rental price or the size of the deposit or so on. This can be modified month by month with a rental agreement, whereas in a lease agreement, it tends to be locked in for the period of the contract. But again, as I mentioned, in Romania, most people don't make that distinction. So when you hear people speaking in English referring to a rental contract, it could still be a lease agreement. The other thing that's in there are the terms and conditions of the rental contract, the obligations of the owner, the obligations of the tenant. So, for example, the owner has the obligation to keep the apartment functioning, so if anything breaks, air conditioning, a water leak, a window not closing, a door lock not working, oven not working, these kind of things, the obligation of the owner is typically to repair those in a very reasonable time frame, so a matter of days, not a matter of weeks. And if you can't, if he's unable to make those repairs in that time, he should give you the rights to be able to organise it yourself and deduct it from the rent. It's not reasonable, for example, to be stuck in November without heating or without the ability to lock a door or something. So again, it's just about being pragmatic, but it's just about being sensible about these things. But these terms and conditions, the obligations of both parties will be covered in the contract, and also your obligations, how you can use the apartment, how many people are allowed to stay there, the kind of purposes you can use it for. So for example, you typically won't be allowed to sub-rent the apartment, to use it for Airbnb or to rent it to another party or to bring additional people in the property. All of that should be clear from the very beginning, how it's going to be used, who's going to stay there, for how long and for what price. The size of the rent, of course, is covered in the rent contract, and any escalators in there. So if it's a long lease, for example, 2, 3, 4 years, you might typically see a rent escalator in there of so many percent per year, 2, 3% per year, or even a limit, so it cannot rise above or below a certain value, but it won't change unless the market changes. And there are any number of variations on that. There could be no escalators. It's entirely a point of discussion between you and the owner. The deposit will be mentioned in there, and you might have typically in Romania you have one rent and one deposit, 1 month of rent, 1 month of deposit at the beginning of an agreement. But if you've got pets, for example, or if you've got multiple students in there and there's any element of suggested risk to the owner, they might ask you to increase that deposit. And normally speaking, you should get that deposit back at the end of your rental agreement, although some landlords, unwisely in my opinion, some landlords allow you to use the deposit as the last rent. But when you do that, of course, it doesn't protect the owner. If there's any damage caused or there's any unpaid bills, the owner's got no way of covering that cost because you've used the deposit as your last rent. So I always advise against that. Deposit should be entirely separate. You should receive it in full at the end, as long as you return the property in the same condition it was given to you, minus normal wear and tear. In other words, minus normal signs of usage of that apartment. It's not supposed to be a show home when you give it back. It should look like someone's lived in it, but it shouldn't look like somebody's abused it. So it shouldn't be holes in the wall, shelves, taken down and the remaining evidence left there, or where you've hung pictures up. Any damage caused like that, you should put it back to its original state. But fingerprints around light switches, this kind of thing, grease on the cooker extractor, this is normal usage evidence, and this is completely fine. Utilities typically won't be covered in the rent. It's very rare to find a landlord covering the utility bills, the gas, water, electricity, internet and admin. Normally that's entirely separate, and it's based on consumption. So normally the rent is stipulated in the rent contract, and everything else on top of that is covered by the tenant. One difference you see here in Romania compared to, say, England. In England, for example, the landlord would typically pay the administration costs of a building, whereas in Romania it's paid for by the tenant. Administration typically in a block of flats would include common cleaning, utilities for things like electricity, common light in the stairwells, maintenance for the elevator, things like this. These are all part of the monthly administration, and they can also include the cost of water in your own apartment and even gas in your own apartment. It depends on how each administration sets up the bill structure differently, but you can find an admin bill contains almost all of your utilities, usually not electricity, but it can include gas, it can include water, it will include the common building costs, and that's something that the tenant picks up in Romania. The condition of the property will be mentioned. Usually there's an inventory at the beginning of a rental agreement which captures the condition of everything. We simply use a score from 1 to 10. So, there's a dining chair and it's a 7 out of 10, and you maybe make some comments that there's some markings on it or whatever. It's very worth taking the time to clarify this at the beginning of an agreement so you don't get into any misunderstandings at the end whereby the owner holds you responsible for, wearing out a chair that actually was already worn. So it's very worth having a detailed inventory, even if you do it by video, and annotate the video by talking over it, explaining the damage. Store the video somewhere, maybe on YouTube or somewhere, but keep a safe copy, a backup copy, so at the end of your tenancy agreement you've got some evidence to go through and demonstrate that you haven't caused any damage in it. Your responsibilities for repair and maintenance will also be covered in the contract. So, for example, if you've got a garden there in the apartment or in the house, it would be your responsibility to maintain that garden in a reasonable condition. And once again, when you've finished with the property, to leave it as it was given to you. Also mentioned in the contract will be access rights for the owner. So typically owners have got access rights as long as they provide you with 24 to 48 hours notice in writing, by SMS, by phone call, or by email. So they can access the apartment to inspect it periodically, and also if they're not able to reach you but there's an emergency, so a smell of gas or electrical problems or smell of fire, the landlord has got immediate access rights to enter the apartment for the safety of the building and for your safety. What else is covered there? Any extended absences, for example, you won't be permitted to be away from the property for more than 30 days or so, in case the apartment is broken into and other damage is caused while you're not there. And also you won't be allowed to, generally speaking, you won't be allowed to turn the heating off. So for example, if you go home or go on holiday over Christmas or over New Year when it's -10 outside, you still need to maintain the heating at a minimum temperature of 7 to 10 degrees, let's say, as a minimum. So these kind of clauses you might see in the contract that oblige you to keep it warm. There'll be limits of tenant behaviour in there, so if you shouldn't, for example, annoy the neighbours or cause any problems with the neighbours. Parking in other people's parking bays, these kind of things. All of these will cause you to be in breach of your contract. There'll be restrictions on the number of occupants, so the named people in the contract will tell you, who is allowed to stay there. And if you need additional guests, it's worth mentioning that in the contract explicitly, to have one additional guest per whatever period. And then any restrictions on use, whether you can use it for business use, whether you can use it for sub-renting, this kind of thing. Whether you're allowed to have pets should be in there, and whether it's, as I mentioned, should be for business use or not. What else? Also, a clause you might see, although it's very rare, is legal fees in the event of a lawsuit between the owner and the tenant. There might be a clause, although it's extremely rare. If you do get into dispute with your landlord, it might say which party is responsible for paying. Typically it would be the losing party that pay the winning party's legal costs, but as I say, it's extremely rare. In 15 years of doing this role, of being a property manager in a rental agency, I've never seen it happen, but it can happen, so best to protect for the worst. Just be sure that if there is any mention of legal costs, that it's bi-directional. So in other words, if you're responsible for paying, you the tenant are responsible for paying the owner's costs if you lose, he should be responsible for paying your costs if he loses. It should be a bilateral agreement, not just unilateral, not just one-sided. And then also finally included in the contract will be grounds for termination. So for example, if either party decides to end the contract, they need to get the other party's agreement and give 30 days notice, or if either party is in breach of the agreement, that will invalidate the contract. So just be conscious of that as well, and just be clear about under what conditions you can leave. It might be, another future pandemic, or you may lose your job. What happens in that case? Typically speaking, if you leave inside the rental period, the agreed period, you would normally lose one deposit. But if, for example, you've given more than one deposit because you've got pets, it's not normal to lose more than one deposit. You should only lose one deposit because the other deposit is related to the pet and not related to your stay. So just be clear, make sure that's clearly in writing, that if you breach the agreement or you leave prematurely, you only lose one deposit from the amount, however many deposits you're given. So that's basically it. What you should try to do is get the contract in dual languages, bilingual, English and in Romanian, or in your native language, Spanish, French, German, in your native language, as well as in Romanian. And anyway, legally speaking, if you've signed only a Romanian contract and there are future complications or future challenges or disputes, there is some argument, some legal argument to say that you signed something you weren't fully aware of, you didn't fully understand it, unless it was legally translated to you by a legally registered translator, in which case it would need to have their translator stamp on the document to prove that you are fully aware of the wording that's in that document. But you can simply bypass that problem by using a bilingual agreement. Also in the rental contract you would normally include the utility readings, the gas, the water, the electricity at the start, so there's no dispute when you get a bill some weeks later that it belongs to a previous tenant who didn't pay the bill, because typically bills come 1 or 2 months after the consumption date. You might get a bill in October that will actually for August or September consumption. So if you've got the meter readings, it's no discussion, no debate. It's very clear. You can see on the bill it's an estimated reading. This is the unit it's being charged for, but because you've got the actual readings, you can work out the cost per unit and subtract the part that doesn't belong to you and leave that for the landlord to resolve with the former tenant. So this basically covers the main things to look out for in a rental agreement. Of course, there are more things to look out for, but that will be more clear to you as you sit and go through the rent contracts. You might have other concerns you want to include in the contract, other conditions that you impose, or the landlord might have conditions he wants to impose upon you. But if you're working with a good agency, they should be able to guide you through this, or of course you can do it yourself and work through a law firm, so you can find the property on your own and then use a law firm to help you with the contract. But generally speaking, when you work through a rental agency, they will do the contract for you, and so you get the service fee as part of the tenant fine service. Just be careful in the case where you're working with an agency who's not charging you a tenant fine fee. There are some cases where the agency only charges the owner, and from my experience, typically when an agency that isn't charging the tenant a fine fee, he's only charging the owner, the contract tends to be biased towards the owner because the owner is the paying client. So just be mindful of that, and be eyes wide open. We're an agency that charge both the tenant and the agency a smaller fee, but we serve both parties, and the contract is entirely neutral and unbiased towards either party. It's simply fair and down the middle of the road. So just be careful of that, you don't get something for nothing, let's say. Just make sure that your rights are properly covered and protected. So I hope this video has been useful to you. If you've got any questions, you can reach me, either send a message in the comment section on this video, or you can reach me from our website, whitemountain.ro, White Mountain Property in Bucharest and Brasov. My details are in the Contact Us page at the top of the website, and I'll be very happy to answer any of your questions. You can send me an email or a WhatsApp, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So I hope you find it useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.